Afternoon and welcome to another Afternoon Light Live, and today I'm joined by the author of a new biography on Gough Whitlam, Troy Bramston, who's also a very popular journalist and columnist for the Australian newspaper. And today we are going to discuss Crashed or Crashed Through, Gough Whitlam and the end of the Menzies era. So the Gough Whitlam Prime Ministership lasted less than 3 years, yet it leaves a huge imprint on Australian life that has endured for over half a century. And of course we're celebrating or commiserating, depending on your views, the 50th anniversary of the dismissal next month on the 11th of November. From Gough's universal healthcare and needs-based school funding to the launch of multicultural Australia, the lowering of the voting age, Whitlam's reforms reshaped not only the machinery of government, but the moral horizons of Australia itself. But Whitlam's story is one of paradox. He was a meticulous policy reformer, but his government descended into chaos. He was a modernising technocrat who saw himself as a latter-day Pericles, the patriotic centralist who both expanded and unsettled the Australian Federation. And he was a visionary whose dismissal 50 years ago in 1975 remains the most dramatic political crisis in our history. So Troy's new biography of Gough Whitlam, the Vista of the New, right here for you to see, hot off the press. He brings freshness to a very familiar story, and I can't wait to get stuck into it today. As always with our Afternoon Light Live, Troy and I will discuss for 30 minutes a range of questions, and then you, our online audience, will have the opportunity to ask a question. So please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will somehow receive the questions right here and ask them of Troy. Feel free to put your name there. I'll give you a shout out. Finally, before we get started, this is the first time we've had a live audience here with us in the Menzies Museum in the Old Quadrangle at Melbourne University. So it's wonderful to see some real humans here, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this all goes. So Troy, a beautiful publication, yet another biography of an Australian Prime Minister. You've written about Menzies, of course, Paul Keating, Bob Hawke. You've written about the dismissal, quite a lot actually, and no doubt we'll be very busy not just promoting this book over the next month, but talking about the dismissal next month. But why did you wait to do a biography of Whitlam, particularly as, you know, reading your book, you were a great admirer of him from a very young age?
Well, yeah, I was an admirer of him, Georgina. I think that, you know, it's 50 years since we had the Whitlam government, and of course it's coming up to the 50th anniversary of the dismissal in 1975. So I thought it was timely to have a look back. I don't really gear my books towards anniversaries. They sometimes just happen that way. But I did feel that there was a need for a new biography that got to the heart of the real Whitlam. So yes, he was a big achiever, but he also made some monumental mistakes, some big blunders, and there's lessons to be learned. I mean, it's always good to write books about people, but if you can draw lessons for the contemporary day, then the book will have a particular relevance. The other thing was I felt that there was a lot of archival material here and overseas that hadn't been fully accessed before. So I was able to access thousands of pages of new documents here and overseas. And I interviewed more than 100 people for the book. So that's really what I bring to my books, is that archival research and the interviews, and then try to draw it together as a story that is interesting for people to read. And yeah, I mean, I had the privilege of knowing Gough as a young man. For the last decades of his life, I'd go and visit him and talk to him, and I'd try to steer the conversation towards topics like what was Robert Menzies like, or tell me about Doc Evatt or Arthur Calwell, and he'd always want to talk about contemporary politics. So yes, for a long time we had a friendly relationship, but this book doesn't pull any punches, and I'm pretty critical of how he ran the government and ran the party.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of books have been written on Gough Whitlam, on the Whitlam era. We've done back of the envelope calculations, and if you don't count all the books we've written on Robert Menzies, it's something like, you know, 70-40, the number of books written on Labor Prime Ministers versus Liberal Prime Ministers, despite the length of time that Liberal Prime Ministers have been in government versus Labor Prime Ministers being the inverse of that. But when you look at the books written about Labor Prime Ministers, over half of them are about Whitlam. So he's he captures the imagination of writers, historians, journalists, academics in a way that no other Labor Prime Minister does. Did you felt that allure as well?
I think a lot of those books are about the dismissal, about the constitutional crisis, but there's really only actually a few full life. Well, this is the only full life biography of Whitlam that's been published since his death in 2014. But the first was Laurie Oakes. He wrote that in 1973. And then Graham Freudenberg wrote a book called A Certain Grandeur, but it really dealt with the end of the Menzies period to the end of the Whitlam period. It was biographical, but it wasn't a biography. And then, of course, there's Jenny Hocking's 2 volumes. So we actually haven't had that many biographical works. So I thought that there was a need to do this in a different way, in a more modern way, and using these new archives and new interviews. And I should say at the outset that I'm very proud of all of my 4 biographies, and I'm going to keep writing them. But I am the only person who's written a biography of Robert Menzies and Gough Whitlam.
And we've got them both on display here, and both available for sale today for our in-person audience.
Good to hear. But you kind of develop a little bit of a Stockholm syndrome where you kind of live with these people in your life. You know, at the end of the day, I talk to my wife and children about them or what I've discovered, or they'd be interested in who I'm interviewing, and so you get to really know them. And you know, I can probably tell you what each of them would have had for lunch today if they were alive, or what they'd think about certain issues. You really immerse yourself in their lives, and you develop a sense of often admiration and respect, but you can also see their flaws. And both Menzies and Whitlam, like all of us, have flaws, and that makes for good character study, which is always the centre of a biography.
Yes, indeed. I recently met the British historian Andrew Roberts, who's written biographies of Churchill and Napoleon, and his study is covered in memorabilia of all his subjects, biographical subjects. Such was his obsession with them. So I can understand your, explanation of just really getting into the person and sort of being subsumed by them.
I should say I have lots of political memorabilia.
Yes.
And I have a picture of Robert Menzies on my wall in my home, as I do other prime ministers. So yeah, and you collect things too. You tend to collect. I've got lots of Robert Menzies signatures on different things, books and speeches and things like that. The other thing you get to do is you get to know their families really well.
Yes.
So I spent a lot of time with Heather Henderson, Robert Menzies' daughter, and the Whitlam family too. The 4 children. They're not really children, but they're in their sort of 70s or older. But you'd really get to know these people.
Yeah. Was there something that surprised you about Gough Whitlam when you wrote this book?
Yeah, look, I mean, we know about the legacy, right?
Yeah.
We know that across the board, things like needs-based school funding, universal health care, no-fault divorce, lowering the voting age, lots of big things, sewering the suburbs of Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. There's a lot of big achievements. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And these things are lasting, right? I mean, they're sort of part of the inheritance, but they're lasting. But they were very controversial at the time and often were strongly opposed. Things like the recognition of China, for example, that was strongly opposed at the time. Robert Menzies, by the way, never thought we should have recognised China. So there are controversial things that are not controversial now. But what surprised me the most was this character of Gough Whitlam, the inner man. And what I found that from the very earliest age, so as a school student, as a university student in Sydney, he had this defining flaw, which was a difficulty in how he related to other people. There's lots of evidence for this, and including his father-in-law, Bill Dovey, who was a New South Wales Supreme Court judge. He said that he had an over-trusting nature, was naive, and had a quick temper. This is his father-in-law, and he said this in an interview before his son-in-law was even Prime Minister. So, Gough didn't have a good sense of how to manage a team, unify a party, manage a cabinet, didn't listen to public service advice, was very much a loner, a man who believed in following his own star. And so these character flaws surprised me a lot, and sometimes he'd get very angry. Some of his staff said to me it wasn't uncommon for him to pick up a chair in the office and throw it across the room. Or grind his teeth in frustration when things didn't go his way. He would lash out at colleagues. I'll tell one quick story, which is that one day he was being verbally assaulted in a cabinet meeting by all the problems that were happening in the government, and ministers wanted to talk about some of these issues, have a political discussion. And he scanned the eyes of his ministers and said, listen, you blokes, this government has one thing going for it, and you're looking at it. And sometimes he'd just simply pack up his papers and leave a cabinet meeting if he wasn't happy with how the discussion was going. He got rolled in the Labor caucus. Labor caucus would overturn cabinet decisions. So that personality flaw makes him a really fascinating study, but he's not really a model for how to run a government.
No, and look, I think when you think about Robert Menzies, who you've obviously thought deeply about, Menzies got a second chance. So he was a flawed first-time Prime Minister, 39 to 41, and then period in the wilderness, learnt a lot through the experience, changed his leadership style a bit, learned how to handle a backbench, a party much better.
Yeah.
Was a much better Prime Minister the second time around. I mean, we will never know
no,
what
that's
a second time around Gough Whitlam would be like.
Georgina, that's a really important point to make about Menzies and the contrast with Whitlam. Some of you may know the story that a colleague once said to Robert Menzies, I think during or just after his first Prime Ministership, said to him, your trouble, Bob, is that you don't suffer fools well. And his response was, well, what do you think I'm doing now? So there's a bit of the Whitlam there, right, in Menzies, but he learnt. Yeah. And I've always thought that one of the essential skills in politics is you have to learn. You have to grow in the job. John Howard is a great example of that. And the best politicians learn from their mistakes. Whitlam never did, but Menzies did. And that was essential for him in forming the Liberal Party, being the principal founder of the Liberal Party in 1944, and then leading it back to government, and then being Prime Minister for so long. I mean, it's chalk and cheese comparing how he ran that first Menzies government to how he ran the second.
Yeah. So back to Whitlam, as much as I'd like to keep talking about Menzies. So origin stories, always interesting. We can be, I guess, pop psychologists and decide it was all formed then. But Whitlam's born in Kew, actually in the what would now today be the seat of Kooyong,
yes.
So Menzies' seat, in 1916, and he has quite a middle class upbringing, very different from your, I guess, the stereotype of a Labor politician of he enters politics in the 50s, but of that era. So
100%.
I mean, what was it about his upbringing that leads him to the Labor Party and Labor politics? Yeah,
so his father becomes the Commonwealth Crown Solicitor in 1936 and holds that position until 1949. That's his father, Fred Whitlam, and he was a public servant in Victoria and then in the national government. Whitlam was born in Melbourne. He only lived here for a few years and then went to Sydney, lived in a range of Sydney suburbs. And then just after Parliament opened in 1927, he went to Canberra. So he's the only Prime Minister we have who grew up in Canberra. And he grew up when Canberra was coming into being. It's a really interesting influence on him, I think, about what a national government can do, what a powerful government can do. But you're right, Georgina, he is born into a very upper middle class family. They're connected. They're moving in elite circles. They don't live a flashy, lifestyle, extravagant lifestyle. They're serious. His parents are serious religious people, Baptists, and they're very focused on their community and their careers and raising Gough and his sister Frida. But it is an upper middle class family. And when Gough gets elected to Parliament in 1952, he's immediately accused of being not a Labor man, they'd say. And this was said throughout his entire career, right up until he's Prime Minister, that he was a silvertail, that he was in the wrong party. It was said in Parliament, actually, you can read the Hansard, where someone said, you were once in the Liberal Party. And there's no evidence that he was in the Liberal Party, but it's very interesting. I spoke to his son, Tony Whitlam, and I asked Tony about these Liberal Party myths and allegations and so on, and he said, look, I think he probably almost certainly was offered the chance to be a Liberal MP. and didn't take that up. Now I think Gough is a Labor person. His father and him admired Doc Evatt, the internationalism of the 1940s Labor government. He's interested in the law. He's a humanitarian. But there were these allegations that came throughout his life, and it's largely because he wasn't a typical Labor person. He didn't have a trade union background. He didn't have a working class background. He never worked in a manual trade. So yeah, he's kind of a fish out of water in the caucus. And the other point to make when he joins in 1952 is there's a young man in an old man's party.
Yeah.
There's sometimes about a 40 or 50 year age gap between some of the old men, and they're all men, in the Labor caucus.
Yeah, and I mean, Doc Evatt doesn't end up ever winning an election, so therefore never becomes Prime Minister, but Whitlam is the first Labor Prime Minister to have a university degree. So Doc Evatt obviously was the first to have a university degree who led the Labor Party, but Whitlam is very different.
Well, that's another contrast.
To your Chifley, to your Curtin, Fisher, Scullin, very, very different. Not just his sort of the affluence of his background, but also his educational attainment.
Yeah, and so he's got 2 degrees from the University of Sydney in law and arts. So he is very different. And when he joins the Labor Party, he moves to Cronulla in 1947 after serving in the war, and he joins the Labor Party branches there. And a lot of the Labor Party branches are talking about how we must nationalise the local corner store. This is Labor policy. And Gough is getting up and saying, this is nonsense. I mean, we have to respect the small businessman and woman and allow a private enterprise to flourish. And some of these comments would end up in almost fist fights in Labor Party branch meetings, because he seemed to be so out of kilter where a lot of Labor members were, and that was believing in socialism.
Yeah, and look, it's interesting. He almost gets kicked out of the Labor Party in the 60s, doesn't he? When he is in favour of state aid, and Caldwell as leader is opposed to it, and they have a complete divergence of opinion, and had been quite friendly. Obviously, Whitlam as deputy leader and Caldwell as leader. And then you see as you say, the young man in the old man's party, Caldwell, sort of the last of the old Labor, old style Labor socialists. This is where Whitlam is this new face of Labor, and with new social democratic policy ideas coming through and battering up against the old guard.
Yeah, I remember Gough Whitlam being very vividly telling me that just before that, with the 1963 Faceless Men scandal, where the Labor Party federal executive and conference wanted to determine the party's position on a naval communications station run by the United States, and that led to the charge of were able to speak to that meeting held at the Hotel Kingston, but they weren't able to vote on that issue. And I remember Gough telling me that Robert Menzies was perfectly entitled and right to say the party was being run by faceless men. And then, of course, 3 years later, he had what was called the Witless Men scandal. So he called the Labor's federal executive the Witless Men, because they were trying to overturn agreed policy, which was to allow the federal government and state governments to provide funding to non-government schools. And we take that for granted today, but this was a big issue that really divided the Labor Party in the 1960s. And Whitlam was on the right side of that. And of course, you'd all know that the New South Wales Labor government had been one of the first governments to provide funding to non-government schools, but the federal executive of the Labor Party overturned that and told the New South Wales government they were not to pursue that policy, which was in a budget and had been announced. And then this led Menzies to call an early election in 1963, where he had promised money for science laboratories and scholarships and things like that. And so Menzies again was able to capitalise on some of the failures in the Labor Party, seen as an old party that wasn't ready for national government.
Something that is important about the Menzies legacy is that sort of identification of middle class Australia and representation of middle class Australia, which Menzies of course famously calls the forgotten people. And he through the 50s, the golden age of economic growth, he's really, the champion of their aspirations and supporting policies like, around home ownership, near total employment of the Australian workforce, high levels of disposable income and the like. It was a great time, right? So the middle class is booming, migrants are coming in, there are jobs for them, there are homes for them. Votes, but the forgotten people's votes, the middle class votes. Whitlam can see that middle Australia is where you're going to win government, and by 1972 they've been out of power for 23 years, so they really did need to change things up. I mean, do you see that his background, his education, his sort of I guess aspirations for Australia were actually borrowing quite a bit from the Menzies approach to campaigning to middle Australia?
There's no doubt that in the post-war period, the middle class expanded rapidly and benefited from many of the policies of the Menzies government. It was a time of stability and a time of prosperity. But by the mid to late 1960s, early 1970s, a lot of the government policies after Menzies had departed had not kept up with what was needed in the suburbs. As the middle class expanded and the suburbs of Australia started to be created and to be filled with new families, the services didn't catch up. And so this is really interesting because what Whitlam does in 1947 is he starts living in Cronulla. Now, I'm particularly interested in this because I grew up in Cronulla. And he lived in Cronulla from 1947 to 1957. It's where he first ran for council twice and lost, ran for the state parliament, lost, and then gets elected to the federal parliament. But what happened there was that Whitlam saw many of the issues that were concerning the middle class in the middle and outer suburbs that had been neglected. So in Cronulla, for example, where Whitlam's living, there's no general hospital. There's no sewage connections. There's no local high school. There's no local swimming pool. But all of these things were in the inner cities where the population was. But as the population expanded, the services didn't keep up. So that was the big agenda that Whitlam saw. And it wasn't doctrinaire, it was pragmatic. He's living in these suburbs and he's seeing the inequality in services. And then when he moves to Cabramatta in 1957, when his seat changed, it's even starker. The disparities in services are even greater. So yes, he is benefiting from that big expansion of the middle class, but the Liberal Party and National parties had lost a lot of that support because they weren't able to maintain the services and support that were needed. Now, some people might go, well, this is a state government problem, but Whitlam saw a federal government problem there, a federal government role there. And that's what he did, and that was a big part of his appeal.
Now, in 1957, he has a really interesting interaction with Menzies. They're obviously opposite sides of the political divide. Menzies is, by this stage, been Prime Minister on the second time for 8 years, almost 8 years. And Menzies invites Whitlam into his office, and there's you sort of wonder, was this a sliding doors moment, don't you?
Yeah, look, I tell this story in both biographies, Menzies and Whitlam, because it's so interesting. And I found it. This is from a recording of an interview that Menzies did with a biographer who was supposed to be his official biographer, but who never got around to writing that book. So I benefited from the interviews that were done for it. And Menzies knew Whitlam. This is really interesting because he comes into Parliament in 1952. Menzies is, of course, Prime Minister. The families knew each other really well. His father-in-law, Bill Dovey, who was later a Supreme Court judge, had been a member of the UAP and had sought pre-selection for the UAP. And when Menzies became Prime Minister in 1939, Bill Dovey wrote him a letter to congratulate him, and he got a response, and that letter hung in Bill Dovey's office for the rest of his life. So he was a conservative guy. And, of course, his father, Fred Whitlam, being the Commonwealth Crown Solicitor, knew Menzies well. And Menzies had a lot of respect for his father. And so the story goes that in the early 50s, that Menzies said to Whitlam, why don't you come in and have a chat? Because Whitlam made a big impact straight away. And one of the things I did for this book was also speak to William Heseltine, who, interestingly enough, was Robert Menzies' private secretary and also later private secretary to the Queen. And he remembered a young Gough Whitlam walking around the corridors of Old Parliament House and did say he had a big impact but it was an impact that was very divisive. You know, he'd been a barrister, and so he's very lashing and slashing in his attacks in Parliament. He's tearing strips off people. He's even fighting inside his own party. So he's making a big impact, but not a great impact in Menzies' view. So Menzies calls him in to his office and he says, "You're a new boy here, and I'm an old scoundrel from your point of view, but I'd like to give you some friendly advice." That's a direct quote. And the discussion goes on and he says, "Look, you're really becoming a disappointment to me because I know your family and I had high regard for you, but you seem to be modelling yourself on Eddie Ward, who was known as the firebrand of East Sydney, this sort of rabble-rousing, old-school, tub-thumping, rattle-trap orator." And he said, "You're following in Eddie Ward's footsteps and you can do a lot better than that." By all accounts, it was a congenial, friendly meeting. They shook hands and they were respectful and friendly towards each other, but Whitlam wasn't going to change his style. It wasn't until much later that he started to be a little bit more measured in his debates. But even still, you know, even in the 1960s, there's a famous encounter where he had a clash with Paul Hasluck, and he threw a glass of water over Paul Hasluck's face in the Parliament. So, you know, Whitlam did have an explosive temper, like his father-in-law said.
Yeah, it's sort of Korean style, this level of antic. Whitlam becomes Labor leader in 1967, replacing Arthur Corwell. And, of course, Menzies is retired by then. He retires beginning of 1966. So Whitlam faces the 1969 election against John Gordon, and then, of course, the 72 election against Billy McMahon, which he wins. But the 69 election is quite a surprise. It's a loss, but I mean, wow, only just. And of course, Labor wins the two-party preferred at that election. I think it's 50.2 to 49.8 to Labor, but of course the seats are where it matters and they don't get enough. But I mean, what, in your opinion, was the most impressive election result? The 69, the 72, or the later ones? Look,
a lot of people have this debate. Look, in that 69 election, Labor got a 7.1% two-party swing. No opposition has ever got a result as strong as that before. And it really was the beginning of the end of John Gordon. He then faced a leadership challenge in the party room after that, and he was on borrowed time. So people will say that was a magnificent effort. But, you know, when you win government, that's got to be the best election result. But the interesting thing about the 1972 election is that it was a close result.
Yeah.
There was only really a handful of seats in it, and Labor had a small majority. And I interviewed Jim Spiegelman, who was later Chief Justice in New South Wales, and Jim worked for Gough in this period and was later his Chief of Staff. And he said to me, we expected to get a big landslide victory, and we operated as if we did. And that was a mistake. So, you know, when you go back and talk to people, you get some frank reflections. But yes, that was one of the problems, was that Labor had only kind of just won. It was a comfortable victory. I think the margin was about 7 or 8 or 9 seat majority.
9 seats. 67 to 58.
Right.
Yeah.
So, look, it's okay, but it's not great.
No.
Not much of a buffer there. And then, of course, in the 1970s...
Nothing on Albo.
Nothing on Albo.
No.
Landslide Albo. But in the 1974 election, of course, Labor then lost some more seats at that election. So, yeah.
But what about McMahon? He must have been... Would another Labor leader have beaten McMahon? I mean, he was... Look, surely he was an easy get, but then not so easy.
Yeah, look, Gough Whitlam always said that Billy McMahon was tenacious and not to be underestimated. But, look, he's pretty awful in hindsight. I mean, he's pretty much an embarrassment to the Liberal Party that they ever made him leader. And that's the assessment of senior Liberals at the time. He was pretty ordinary. And what was really interesting about this book is I spent a lot of time writing about Harold Holt, John Gordon, and Billy McMahon, and also Billy Snedden. And so that was really interesting to look at this side of politics and what was happening there too. So, McMahon seemed to be... What I write is, and I went through his cabinet papers, what I write is that he seemed to be sort of understanding a lot of the changes and the need for a more focus on women's issues or Indigenous issues or urban planning issues, but he was too slow to respond, often too reactive or didn't react, and sort of never really got a handle on things. And, you know, he didn't trust his party room either. They didn't trust him. He leaked all the time. And so it wasn't a sort of a happy period. But, he nearly held on.
So we've got to almost 3:30, and of course I've only asked half my questions, haven't even got to the election of Whitlam, let alone the dismissal or the post-Prime Ministerial life, but I'm sure the audience questions will deal with those topics. If you are online and watching, please do put your questions in the Q&A box. I'm getting some through now. Wow, quite a few. So that's brilliant. But I'll start with the first one, who is actually from a person in our studio audience today, or museum audience, from Peter Collins. So thank you, Peter. I recall vividly Gough coming to my school in 74 when he was PM and I was in secondary school. What do you think Gough would say if he were to speak at a school in 2026 about Australia's future, how to reform our institutions and the need to make our parliamentary system work more effectively?
It's a good question, because even in the ashes of the dismissal, when Whitlam was, defeated after that with the 1975 election, of course, and then defeated again in 1977, he didn't become bitter. He remained an optimist about Australia's future. He went straight to work at ANU, taking classes and giving lectures and writing books and things like that. He later became an ambassador. So, he's kind of a patriot. He believes in Australia strongly. He served this country in war. He served this country in Parliament as Prime Minister and then as an ambassador. So he's very much focused on the future. So I think he'd be encouraging of young people at school to get involved in the democratic processes, learn about your country, make a contribution in whatever field you think is worthwhile. He'd recommend public service, I think, of course. But, he was a barrister for many years and he would see that as a kind of a semi-public role, performing a public good. So he'd be encouraging about that. And look, one of the things I did in the retirement years writing about him is that he would always send letters to Kim Beazley or Paul Keating or Simon Crean or any of these people telling them what they should be doing. Have a referendum on this, have a referendum on that. I think he lost about 6 referendums. So he was a big believer.
Better to avoid that advice, clearly.
Yes, he was a big believer in referendums. And of course he'd want Australia to be a republic. So he'd be advocating that. But he always had ideas and he was always encouraging.
He didn't much like our constitution, did he? I mean, he was very active in the 1944 powers referendum. Sorry, we've got the audience questions here and I'm ignoring them. But I mean, I think I had written in my notes that he was serving in our Air Force, Royal Australian Air Force. But at that 1944 powers referendum, where Curtin's trying to expand the federal government's powers, he sort of Whitlam determined then and there that he wanted to modernise the Australian Constitution. Obviously, that sort of centralising urge of putting more power in the hands of the federal government so it can do more.
Yeah, that was, at university he was interested in politics and issues, but he didn't join a political party, he didn't join a political club on campus, so he wasn't sort of energised or radicalised like a lot of students were. But it was when he was serving in the war and that referendum came up, that's the galvanising moment for him where he wanted to get into politics on the Labor side. And interestingly, in 1956, he was appointed to the Committee on Constitutional Review by the Menzies government. It was an all-party committee, and that worked for several years about how to reform the Constitution, and he played a very big role in that and came up with this idea using the Constitution that there's a section in it which is Section 96, which enables the Commonwealth to give grants to the states and local government for particular purposes. And so he seized on that as a way he could deliver Labor's program.
Yeah, and of course, the external affairs power becomes another vehicle through which invariably Labor governments, but some coalition governments have used their powers. A question from George Paxton in Miami, Florida.
Wow.
Do you think President Nixon's visit to China in 1972 paved the way for Whitlam's recognition of China? Also, what was Whitlam's relationship to both Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford?
It's a good question. It's a very interesting one. I interviewed Henry Kissinger for the book just before he died. Got a good perspective on Australia-US relations there. But in actual fact, Whitlam goes to China first. In 1971, as opposition leader, he goes before Kissinger. And Kissinger's there to prepare for the Nixon visit the following year in 1972. And as Whitlam is leaving China to go to Japan, Kissinger is arriving for the secret talks. So they kind of cross like ships in the night. It's very interesting because it's said that the Chinese thought this is important to have, even though Labor's in opposition, to have a Western allied country come and advocate recognition could help them with their relationship with the United States. But there's no doubt that Richard Nixon deserves that big credit. And of course, it completely flummoxed the McMahon government, who had no warning and had said that Whitlam's visit to China was pure folly. He said it was like a fisherman playing a trout. And it was an embarrassment to Australia that Whitlam had gone to China. And then, of course, days later, Henry Kissinger arrives and announces that Richard Nixon would go. So there's rarely been a bigger moment in Australian politics where a Prime Minister has had egg on their face. But yes, Whitlam did go as Prime Minister in 1973.
But, I mean, there's an interesting question around the relationship with Richard Nixon, of course. There had been a view, and you were debunking it in your book, that Whitlam's criticising Nixon's Christmas bombing of Vietnam, and that's a real rift in the US-Australia relationship. And then Nixon is starting to speculate that we might just scrap the ANZUS Treaty, and concerned that Whitlam will kick the Americans out of Pine Gap. So was the alliance really on the line? Did Nixon really detest Whitlam that much that he would have scrapped the alliance with Australia?
Yeah, the US-Australia alliance was never on the line. This is a myth. I think that's come out of some parts of academia. There's no evidence for that, and Henry Kissinger made it very clear to me that yes, there were differences, strong differences, criticism of Whitlam, criticism of Nixon from either of them, and relations did hit a bit of a low point. But there was never any chance that the US were going to junk the alliance. We are too important to the Americans in this region. We were then, even more so now. And the documents back up that I discovered in the US presidential libraries back up what Kissinger had told me, that it never reached an operational point. There was consideration of it, but in fact, the Nixon administration concluded after a review, and this was finalised under Gerald Ford, that they should actually seek to expand the US presence in Australia. So that doesn't sound like trying to junk it to me.
Yeah, I mean, you I think say in your book that Kissinger told you Nixon often spoke figuratively, blowing off steam, and his advisors usually just ignored his tirades. And in this particular occasion against Whitlam, they just,
Yeah, and if you listen to those White House tapes with Nixon talking about anyone,
and they're all recorded,
you'd think, oh my God, this person's finished.
Yeah.
But that was often just Nixon blowing off steam.
A question here from James Gray, and I'm sure everyone wants to know your thoughts on this one. Why is Kerr, Sir John Kerr, of course, who's the Governor-General who dismissed Whitlam, why is Kerr hated more than Fraser, Malcolm Fraser, the leader of the Liberal Party, who then is appointed Prime Minister after the Whitlam dismissal?
Well, what I say in the book is the dismissal is a train wreck for our political institutions. What Whitlam was doing is trying to govern without supply, and you can't do that. He needed to get supply, and he never had a viable solution to the crisis. The memos that I uncovered showed that he ignored advice from public servants that there was a dismissal risk if he didn't get supply, and he ignored that. There were a range of strategies and ideas and things he could have done, and he didn't do it. Malcolm Fraser, though, was cold-blooded and ruthless and pushed the political system to the brink. He shattered precedents, smashed conventions, and he blocked supply with a tainted Senate. And that had never happened before. So he pushed the system to the brink. He's the one who causes this crisis. And he would argue he cloaked his actions in high morality, arguing that he needed to get rid of the Whitlam government, and there would have been a lot of people supporting that. But no one's ever done that before, and no one would ever do it again. John Kerr was in the middle, and he had a difficult position to do, and he should have compromised. He should have tried to seek a compromise. He should have encouraged Whitlam to do a deal with Fraser, and Fraser had offered him a number of deals, such as having an election in 1976, and he didn't do that. Instead, he cloaked his thoughts and feelings and intentions from Whitlam, and that is a mistake. That is a failure of a constitutional monarch who would never do that. They must have frank and open discussions with their Prime Minister, and where Kerr failed was with a surprise dismissal without warning. Now, he should have warned Whitlam. That's where Kerr went wrong, and that's why Kerr has been admonished, because he didn't allow Whitlam an opportunity to go to an election as Prime Minister if he couldn't solve the supply crisis. No Governor-General has ever said since that they would repeat what Kerr did. It is a breach of the protocol and conventions, and I think I say pretty clearly in the book that the Queen had a dim view about this. They think he mishandled the crisis at the end point with that surprise dismissal. So that's why Kerr was admonished that way. A lot of people thought this was wrong, that a democratically elected government should be dismissed by one man elected by nobody. And that's why there was such a strong public reaction to that. And John Kerr felt that very, very carefully. And in the book, I reveal a lot of John Kerr's personal handwritten notes as he agonises over this decision in later years. And of course, he lived many years in exile in the UK.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we will hear a lot more about the dismissal over the next week or so as we lead up to the 50th anniversary. A question here from Peter Edwards, which really links into what you've just been saying, Troy. Troy, as you make clear, Whitlam's choice of John Kerr to be Governor-General was against advice from colleagues, public servants and Margaret Whitlam. What was it about Kerr that led Whitlam to insist on the choice and say it was an excellent appointment until the 11th of November 1975?
He did say that. And look, this is a blind spot. He didn't really know Kerr that well. Kerr, I say, was the fifth choice to be Governor-General. He wanted Paul Hasluck to stay on, wouldn't do it. He offered the job to Ken Meyer, wouldn't do it. Offered it to Lance Barnard, wouldn't do it. Offered it to Frank Crean, wouldn't do it. He settles on John Kerr, the fifth choice. They'd known each other at the bar and in legal circles in Sydney, but didn't really know each other that well. What Whitlam didn't understand was that Kerr had been a Labor supporter and a Labor Party member in the 30s and 40s. By the 50s, he's attracted to the Democratic Labor Party, and by the 60s, he's dreaming of being a Liberal Prime Minister. I uncover these oral history interviews that have not been revealed before with John Kerr, and also his own notes and discussions about these things, but he thought he could succeed Menzies. He says it openly. I was being approached by persons left, right and centre about a career as a Liberal politician, and that's where he identified. Now, I'm not saying that's the reason he dismissed Whitlam, but Whitlam certainly misread him if he thought he was going to be on side, which is what Whitlam kept saying about him. And Whitlam didn't treat him very well. He kept saying the Governor-General must do as I say. He has no independent role. He must follow his Prime Minister's advice. And, of course, the Governor-General does have reserve powers, and they can be used, and he did use them. He also referred to Kerr as my Viceroy all the time. And I have a memo from public servants saying, don't call him that. It's condescending, it's rude, and you don't want to get this guy offside in a potential constitutional crisis. But in typical Whitlam fashion, he ignored that.
Right, and that was in the lead up.
That's in the lead up, yeah.
I'll stick on the dismissal questions, even though we do have lots of other ones coming through. So just scrolling through here, a question from Robert Masters. Can you reflect on the relationship between Graham Freudenberg and his role, or not, in Whitlam's statement about the Governor-General on the steps of Parliament House, that very famous statement, which you might like to replay?
You can do it if you like. So, Graham is the greatest speechwriter in Australian political history. Wrote speeches for Neville Wran, Barry Unsworth, Bob Hawke, Bob Carr, and, of course, Gough Whitlam. He's Gough Whitlam's closest friend outside of politics and outside of family. He's his closest friend outside of family. He's the closest association he had. They worked together really closely for a long period of time. From the moment Whitlam became opposition leader right through to Whitlam's death, he's still writing speeches and articles and book introductions and things like that. Graham says, I interviewed Graham a lot. He was a friend of mine. I talked to him regularly. And Graham said to me, that's the speech he's most known for, meaning Gough, but he had nothing to do with it whatsoever. So what simply happened is, if you look at the footage, Sir David Smith is reading the dissolution of Parliament. He ends that dissolution by saying, and may God save the Queen, which Whitlam had removed from the 1974 dissolution of Parliament. But, of course, he's now dismissed, and so Smith and Kerr decided we're going to add this back in. And Smith, who I also interviewed several times and used to talk to him, he didn't know that Gough Whitlam was standing behind him. He didn't know. Whitlam towers over the top of him, And when he walked away from the microphone, Whitlam then seized the microphone and seized the moment. And of course he says, well, may we say, God save the Queen, picking up on that end point of the dissolution, because nothing will save the Governor-General. Now, Graham had no role in that. Whitlam had no notes. He didn't really know what was going to happen. He just seized the moment. And that just shows you, you can have speechwriters and they can be great, but you've got to be a great speech maker yourself if you want to be known as a great speech maker. And Robert Menzies is another who was also a great speech maker.
Yeah. All right, we'll go back to Nixon. Question here from Tim Lynch, professor and Robert Menzies Institute board member. Thanks, Tim. Brilliant book, Troy. Whitlam was PM during much of Nixon's short second term. Both men were forced from office. What did they think of each other? We've sort of discussed it a bit. Does the right misremember Nixon the way the left does Gough?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think they ever really had much to do with each other in those final years. I mean, Richard Nixon lived for another 20 or so years. And, a lot of the Nixon policies were very similar to the Whitlam policies. On healthcare, on social welfare policy, on economic policy. There's a lot of similarities there. I mean, Nixon looks almost progressive compared to more modern Republican presidents. So they would have had a similar view about a lot of issues, certainly not the Vietnam War though, but they would have had a lot of interest in different issues, and they got on really well. And after this famous clash that they had, Whitlam met Nixon at the White House in 1973, and Whitlam conceded to Kissinger before they went into the Oval Office that he was a little bit nervous. Now, Gough Whitlam never got nervous about anything, but he was a bit nervous about meeting Tricky Dicky. Anyway, the meeting went really well. They were very friendly. Nixon said, we need to work out our problems. I can't see that we're going to have any problems. And then Nixon famously said to him, I've never met an Aussie I didn't like. And so they got on pretty well, I think, after that. And he certainly got on well with Gerald Ford as well. So it's an interesting contrast between the two men.
What about the way the right remembers Nixon and the left remembers Whitlam? I mean, as Tim was saying, is it about sort of the hagiography of each, or?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. I mean, I do think the left idealisation of Whitlam is probably a bit over the top, and certainly they don't pay enough attention to his flaws and his mistakes and the scandals.
I mean, Bob Hawke did not
right.
rate him at all.
Bob Hawke and Bill Hayden and Paul Keating learnt the lessons of what went wrong during the Whitlam government. It had a searing effect for them, and they decided they wouldn't repeat them. And so they were very determined to do that. I've made a joke at the book launch, with the Prime Minister launched the book, and I made a joke that in 1975, true believers around Australia became experts in sport because they always read the back pages of the newspaper, not the front, which had all the scandals and the blunders and the mistakes.
Interesting question here from Neil James. Thanks, Neil. Gough Whitlam is the only ALP Prime Minister to have ever served in the ADF. What effect did this have, especially regarding strategic policy issues, noting that no Australian PM in World War II had served in World War I?
Yeah, look, that's interesting too. I mean, I think the World War II experience had a big impact on Whitlam. For a lot of World War II servicemen, and my grandfathers both served in the Second World War, it was the enduring friendships that they created. Whitlam had certainly had some friends, but he was exposed to a whole range of new issues. It was the end of empire at the end of the Second World War, the end of colonialism. And I found some of these great letters that he wrote to his parents at the end of the war saying, we're not going to have these big empires controlling regions and countries in the Asia Pacific anymore. And so there was this sort of decolonisation that happened after World War II, and Whitlam felt that very strongly. That's why he accelerated the independence for Papua New Guinea, for example. So that's the kind of impact the war had on him, I think, and seeing a new world and seeing a world remade, maps redrawn, and he was very attracted to the Curtin Chifley government and a lot of the things that they put on the agenda, and that was what inspired him to go into politics.
What about his attitude, though, to the US, just sort of US power, US sort of quasi-imperial ambitions, that was he a US skeptic, or was he
This
more
is
sanguine about the US?
this is another element of why the idea that the US were going to junk the alliance is wrong, because the US felt they could rely on Whitlam. They saw Whitlam as an alliance supporter, him and his deputy Lance Barnard, who was also a war veteran. That's what they say in the memos. We can rely on Whitlam against the extreme left elements in the Labor Party to protect what were US bases and to maintain the alliance. Whitlam had visited the United States many times. I have this great photograph and account in the book of him meeting Lyndon Johnson when he was president in 1967. And, Johnson 6'3", Whitlam 6'4", big men. But at that meeting at the White House, and Whitlam made a number of public statements, he said the United States was the greatest country in the world. That's what he said in 1967. So he's a big supporter of the US alliance. And it doesn't mean he was uncritical of the US or some of their foreign policy decisions, but he had that instinctive feel that we need the US alliance.
A question here from Jeffrey Good. Thank you, Jeffrey. Would you comment on the frustrating positions Labor and the Coalition took on legislating for proportional representation for the Senate, which was in 1948, for Evatt to insist on full marking of preferences and reject the Coalition's amendment for partial optional preferential marking, but saw Whitlam as PM moving to introduce partial marking only to have the Coalition block that in the Senate? And with the reform only taking effect in 2016 when Turnbull as PM succeeded with the support of the Greens. Jeffrey is obviously a real follower
of the ins and outs of electoral laws. That's probably a little bit out of the scope of my book. Yeah. But Whitlam was a big believer in reforming the electoral system. And of course we do have proportional representation and we have optional preferential voting in some states. But he was a big proponent of modernising electoral law. So he brings in territory senators for the first time. He lowers the voting age to 18, and he brings in one vote, one value electoral laws. That means there can't be a gerrymandering of federal electorates. So he made a number of important electoral reforms, and that one actually passed in the joint sitting, the only time we've ever had a joint sitting in 1974 of both houses. So Whitlam was very interested in electoral laws and chalked up some important achievements in that space, but he was hopeless on getting referendums carried.
Yeah. This is an interesting question, unfortunately from Anonymous, but thank you, Anonymous. In what way is the Labor Party of today still Whitlam's party?
Look, it's interesting. I think that a lot of the agenda that Whitlam elevated, like universal healthcare, needs-based school funding, some of these things are now part of the really strong Labor Party DNA. And the international agenda, going to China, for example, which was opposed by the Coalition at the time and opposed by Robert Menzies. And so they're very much wedded to that Whitlam legacy. Labor, of course, look only at the positive things, but it's very interesting. People should go back and look at what the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said at the book launch. He said that he told me in the weeks leading up to it that he was reading the book and he's thinking about himself. How would he have acted in this situation? What would he have done? What does he make of this situation that Whitlam was in? How would he have handled it? So Albanese said that there are lessons to learn from Whitlam, and some of those lessons aren't all positive. Some of those lessons are about how to run a cabinet, how to run a party, how to stage policy reforms, how to communicate with voters. And so it's interesting that Albanese is able to claim the Whitlam legacy in many policy areas, but he's also looking at where he can learn from Whitlam and be a better Prime Minister. And I think one of the successes of Anthony Albanese, although I do think his agenda lacks a little bit of courage, I do think that he has been a good manager of the Labor cabinet, working cooperatively with the public service, managing his party. There's been no major scandals, resignations, anything like that. And by all accounts, the cabinet works rather collegiately together.
Yeah, but Whitlam is a salutary tale for any Prime Minister, but particularly Labor Prime Ministers, and of course, Bob Hawke takes this to heart, on his economic management. It was disastrous.
It was disastrous.
And just not realising that ultimately Australian people want an economy that's working, that's doing well, and to take your eye off that and be distracted by a whole range of other things is just fundamentally catastrophic.
Look, the economic management's the most important task, I think, for any government outside, say, national security. And what happened was that it would have been better if Labor was elected in 1969. If you go back and look at Whitlam's 1972 policy speech, he says we're going to fund our policies through economic growth, right? Meaning he doesn't have any funding for Labor's policies. That's what he says in 1972. And of course, the economy started to turn very sour around the world. There's the oil shocks, there's an inflationary spike, unemployment rises to a post-war high. So a lot of these things aren't necessarily caused by the Whitlam government, but they're made worse by some of the policies of the Whitlam government. He paid little attention to the budget, little attention to the economy. Bob Hawke was very critical of this. So was Bill Hayden. Bill Hayden, I reveal in the book, is writing memos and notes to Whitlam saying we've got to focus more on the economy and the budget. We've got to do this, we've got to do that. So a lot of people were saying it, but it really didn't get a lot of attention from Whitlam, and that's a big mistake.
A question here from Caroline Solanes. Thanks, Caroline. And it's really pertinent to a lot of the work we do here at the Menzies Institute in our schools program. Are these important historical discussions around, say, things like the dismissal, the sort of key moments in our democratic history? Do we have enough of these discussions at school with our teachers sort of discussing the dismissal and why it mattered and what it says about our democracy and I guess as a lesson in our civics and civic institutions?
I agree entirely. I think we have dropped the ball on civics and citizenship education in this country. I think it should be a compulsory subject taught in high school. And, there are some ways, I mean, you would know more about this, Georgina, but there are some high schools that can choose Whitlam and Menzies as a topic to study in modern history. And I've spoken to some of those classes. They've invited me in because I wrote the Menzies book to talk to them about Menzies. But it's optional. It's not widespread. That's a shame. I think we really need to get that back because, one of the great things about this country is our compulsory voting, I think. It keeps us centred, it keeps us grounded, it includes everybody in the system. But we need to be continuing to educate people about what government is and the role they can play. Citizens have rights, but they also have obligations. And so we don't do enough about that. And that's why these podcasts that I'm doing here and others and conferences and things like that are always really important.
Another question, I think this is really interesting, and there's lots of debates about this. But unfortunately from Anonymous, but thank you once again, Anonymous. Who do you think really represents the working classes today? And I think by who, it's which political party or politicians?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question. What struck me was looking at some of the electoral data when Whitlam was leader, is that he's the last Labor leader to really win a big majority of the working class vote. So a lot of people see Whitlam as a bit of a dilettante, interested in the arts, snappy dresser, well-educated, but he's getting more working class votes than Bob Hawke, Paul Keating, Rudd, Gillard, Anthony Albanese ever got. So he's maintained that working class base in the 1970s, but he expanded that base into the middle class, the aspirational Australians, the baby boomers, which we talked about at the start. So today, it's a contested ground. The Labor Party still gets most of the working class vote, but we're seeing what I've called over many years a de-alignment in our politics, where the Liberal Party, to an extent, but now other parties on the far right, such as One Nation or the Liberal Democrats, and even elements of the National Party, are getting increasingly a proportion of this working class vote. But the working class is much reduced as a proportion of all voters than it was 50 years ago. The sort of manual trades voters. Today we might call working class voters, cleaners and hospital workers and people like that. But they're not manual trade workers. They're not working in the coal mines or factories and things like that. So it's changed, but it's a contested ground. Yeah.
We have time for one very, very quick little question here, and it's about younger voters. So, again, from Anonymous, did Menzies create the young Australians who were attracted to an educated urbane Whitlam? And I guess I would just ask on top of that, to contextualise it, Menzies was popular with younger voters. You know, the Liberal Party in 49 was seen as a young kind of party, a party that attracted women too. And I mean, that's very different from the polling today and who supports the Liberal Party today. But what about for Whitlam?
Look, it's really interesting, Georgina. You and I have actually talked about this off the podcast. You know, the Menzies Liberal Party had more women supporters than men. The Labor Party was a very male-dominated electoral cohort. And the Liberal Party had more young people than the Labor Party attracted older voters. That flipped, and it flipped with Whitlam. So Whitlam is the first Labor leader to really increase the proportion of female voters into their voting for that party, and also younger voters. And particularly when he lowers the voting age to 18 at the end of, I think, 1973, so they vote for the first time in 1974, that's where we see those shift. And the Labor Party's never really looked back from having the young voters and more women than the Liberal Party, although John Howard probably challenged a little bit of that for a period. And so this is a really interesting aspect to how politics has changed, is where that support came from.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it'll keep changing. We are at 4 o'clock and at the end of our Afternoon Light Live. Thank you so much for joining us either online or in person, to all of you. A quick shout out to you all for some upcoming events. We have our Christmas drinks on the 26th of November. We will have a debate. Who was the better leader, Menzies, Thatcher or Trump? So watch out for that. Do come along. Our conference is on the 27th and 28th of November on Menzies and the British Commonwealth of Nations. And finally, our final event for the year will be the book launch of A Step to the Right, The Life of Times of Alexander Downer, someone I know well, on the 15th of December. So thank you so much to Troy. All the best for the, no doubt, very, very busy weeks ahead, promoting Gough Whitlam, the Vista of the New, available here, but obviously online. Your wonderful publishers at HarperCollins have many books to sell, and I'm sure they will rush out the great for Christmas. And, of course, the Menzies biography as well is available. So thank you.
Thanks, Georgina.